Hi guys, King Ches here, back with another video. Today's video is a tier list. We got the patch notes, a patch note video yesterday, and today we're going to be doing a tier list for the upcoming season like we did at the start of last season. And we're going to be using these patch notes to make a prediction on what we think the meta will be. Today, I'm joined by fellow council member Inferns.
Hey everyone.
And we also have a very special guest. I'm very surprised he managed to take some time out of his hard ladder grinding, as he is currently sitting atop of the ranked ladder, and he is fighting for that number one spot. It is none other than Mr. Redrame himself. Hello, Redrame. How are you?
Howdy.
Okay, so yeah, how do we think this season's going to be panning out coming forward? Do we think there's going to be any huge meta changes, guys? Do we think there's anything you guys want to talk about first? Red Dream?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I don't. The big thing to me, it sort of seems like a lot of decks will sort of just adapt based on, like right now, Vi and Skelliga are doing pretty well. And it seems like a lot of other decks will just sort of move around based on what those matchups look like, given that both of them, I think, are getting hit the hardest by the patch.
Yep.
Yeah, it's difficult to say. Justice nerf definitely matters a lot for ST as well. I honestly, like, the level 1 analysis of, like, Nilfgaard and Northern Realms being the factions that are doing very well that didn't get nerfed, it honestly seems like it could just be correct here. I think both of those factions will probably be very strong.
For sure. I can see that. You did touch upon a few of the nerfs that came, and I think probably the biggest nerf that we saw this patch is going to be on the Vi, which is also probably the top deck this patch, right? Like, everything's having to build itself around Vi. So maybe we should start with Vi and where we think it is, because like last patch I think we put it in A, but there was definitely a consideration to have it as S because of just how it like warps the meta.
Yeah,
right?
there's sort of a difference in terms of like theoretical strength and pragmatism for laddering, because Vi is the type of deck where it's like if you queue into the wrong deck, you're going to lose.
Yeah.
And I think if you're trying to go for like a top spot, you're trying to get skill matchups in as many areas as you can. So yeah, I sort of agreed with you putting it in A, even though the deck, I think, in terms of raw power, is ridiculously strong.
And I think after this patch, though, I think it's going to be moving down the tier list, right? Because now it's super favorable matchups maybe aren't so favorable anymore. You maybe don't need these tech cards because it's lost a lot of power, right? It lost 2 provisions and a point. So on every single V, you're losing a point. So you probably have to cut 1 tutor and you're losing that carryover as well. So it's quite a hefty nerf for V. I'm honestly not even sure we'll see it played in any competitive sense next season, to be honest.
Yeah, so there's definitely the argument that it's lost a lot of power. There is also the angle that the ladder won't be built around stopping Vi anymore. So that does maybe give it some little power back, but I kind of agree that it's not going to be great, although I think it's going to be probably the second choice for monsters after Keltalis. So hey, it's still... I would put it in C tier, but maybe I could see a D. Not sure on that one.
Red Dream?
Yeah, it's kind of tough for me, because I think both in terms of it losing a ton of power and also sort of like I was saying earlier, I think like right now, if I had to say what decks tend to what decks do Vi struggle against, a lot of it would be Nilfgaard and Northern Realms. Those decks feel like they beat Vi the most often. And in theory, there will be a lot of both of those. So it's kind of really bad positioning wise, but I think the card might still have enough raw power to justify a C. Like when I see the D, I just think Congregate, and I don't think this is a Congregate level card. Plus, in my list, you wouldn't actually have to cut a tutor; you would just cut riders.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I can I don't mind putting it in C and seeing where it goes. I think this C is probably like us being like generous, but I could see it not seeing any play and be, at least in a competitive sense, and just being a D and being like a Congregate where you just don't see it. It's like you see it one game in 100 and you're like, what the hell? Why is this card being played again?
Yeah.
But I could see it being a C and like people experimenting with it, trying to catch people off guard if it does still have these super polarized matchups. If you can find those, then maybe. That would probably move us on now to Keltullus, which we did actually have as our strongest deck last patch, which I think was probably an overestimate. I think it should have been a little lower. The meta seems to have not suited it as much as we thought it was going to. And I think this patch didn't get any buffs, any nerfs, anything like that. So I think I would probably stick it in A this season. I think it's going to be strong. It's Monster's strongest thing, so you probably will see it a bit more this season than last season because of the nerf to Vi. And it does have some good matchups. Like you said, Northern Realms and Nilfgaard are two of the strongest decks, and I think Kali's quite good into those. It's like at least not bad into those decks. So I can see it being pretty reasonable and pretty common as well.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be very common, in my opinion, just because I think that Skelliga and maybe even Squirtle are going to decrease in popularity. And I think people still aren't going to play Syndicate. So I think people are still going to play monsters, and if you're looking for a monsters deck, Kelly is the obvious choice, now that Vi is significantly weaker. So I think it will definitely be popular. In terms of its strength, I think A would be reasonable. I don't think our S was appropriate last season. Well, it was correct, at least. So I think A would be a decent place for Kelly to sit.
Yeah. I was sort of debating between an A and a B, but I think I agree that it's closer to an A. I think the argument that monsters will probably need to be played next month makes sense. It will still have a lot of the power. There weren't any changes to like Siri Dash or anything like that, which I was kind of hopeful that maybe there would be, but
yeah, I'm surprised Dash and Kelly have gone and nerfed this long, but
yeah. Kelly I don't mind as much. Kelly is one instance and you really pay for it. Dash just feels like, oh yeah, by the way, this deck sometimes draws a card.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, card advantage cards, anything that manipulates like CA are always extremely powerful and degenerate, right? But okay, that would seem pretty easy for monsters. I guess we can move on to the other easy faction, which is Syndicate. So let's start with Congregate. I think we all have an opinion on where we think this should go, right? I think the meta suits it really well this season, and we did a video on it, and we won both games, and it was super easy. We beat Dwarfs, and we beat somebody who completely misplayed Fish Flappers. So I think, judging by that, it should be S tier. I mean, it's got a 100% win rate on this channel. Of course, all jokes
I had a 50% win rate with it. I mean, if you average that, it's 75. That's still pretty good. I'd give it like a B.
No, but all jokes aside, I think I queued Congregate maybe once or twice this season, and there's a reason for that, right? It doesn't really do well into anything. The swarm aspect is one thing that is, you will note, is if Nilfgaard is actually super popular and good, this could be okay. If Nilfgaard was like 60-70% of the ladder, it might actually have a decent matchup into that. But I don't think outside of that sort of matchup, I don't think Congregate really has anything going for it. There's swarm decks that do better in like elves, right, with their movement engines and stuff. There's a whole lot of control, so all their tall units, like Tall Punish, is quite popular, which will deal with their Fallen Knights, which are their most powerful like engine sort of thing. And then obviously it struggles from the fact that if it loses round one, you can manipulate the reins to get an advantageous position against it. So I think Congregate is probably the weakest of these decks that we've got. However, it isn't completely meme deck, right? It is still a playable deck. It still has functionality. It does have synergies and stuff. So like if you're looking to play an outside deck this season, if you're on like rank ladder or you just want to have fun, I think Congregate is perfectly fine for that. But if you're looking to secure top spots and stuff, I don't think many people will be playing Congregate personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's probably the weakest deck on this tier list. The good Nilfgaard matchup might make it a bit more popular this season, or in this coming season. But yeah, I'd agree on D.
Yeah. Congregate has just always been kind of a weird deck because it kind of wants to swarm, but it doesn't actually really get the payoffs of swarming. It kind of feels like it just goes tall and wide. And so it seemed like it was really dependent on just having a lot of points. And it sort of slowly feels like Congregate has fallen behind in terms of points, just with so many other decks gaining so much.
Yep.
And then the lack of control, too, of course, doesn't really do it any favors. Like, even Witchers look like this deck really makes Witchers look like Lockdown.
Yeah, that is true. That is very, very true. Okay, then we move on to Passiflora. Now, Passy it's lost one of its best matchups, which was Vi. Thinking Vi's not going to be super popular. But at the same time, Passy's also going to benefit from the fact that I think some of these these punish cards for Vi are going to be going out. All of these control tools to deal with all the consume engines and all these toll punishes to deal with the Vi's and stuff, which were actually unironically hurting Passy to a certain extent. Now, I'm not saying I think Passy's going to be particularly good, but I think the meta might shift more towards it, especially if we're thinking Nilfgaard will be slightly better this season and more popular again. Passy seems to, if you stick a Colkin, has a pretty good matchup against Nilfgaard, I think. So I could see it being at least playable somewhat. I don't think it's going to be super popular, but I don't think it's going to be any worse than Vi, personally.
I think I agree with your placement for a completely different reason.
Okay.
I think the reason I would see Passy maybe being a little bit more playable this month is that I think that you actually have more of an argument for actually needing a fourth faction. I think that the deck will still be pretty weakly placed into the meta. But you potentially could have more options, like if Kelly doesn't pan out, or if Scoia'tael ends up being too weak without Justice, or if Skelliga just doesn't really have a deck. Passy just kind of feels like it has always been there. And I actually think that with this patch, the power level has gone slightly down, most likely.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think Passy will have more of a chance. I don't think that it will actually have good matchups relative to last month. I think losing the Vi matchup hurts a lot. It felt like pretty much the only good one. I would not consider it a counter to Nilfgaard at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I think it does really horribly into Nilfgaard. Yeah. I do think that the deck is significantly better than Congregate, though. I don't really think any other deck belongs in the Congregate tier. I think it kind of just needs to be emphasized how much worse Congregate is than these other decks.
Okay. Infants?
Yeah. I'd agree on the point that you're gonna be searching for a fourth faction potentially when your Scoia'tael and your Skelligers get nerfed. You're gonna be potentially looking at the sixth faction and bringing it up to maybe fourth. Whether or not most people will do that, I don't know. I think Skelliga and Scoia'tael will still be better than Syndicate for most people, but if you're looking for a Syndicate deck, it's probably going to be Passy over this Congregate Swarm list. So I think C tier is definitely fair. Okay.
Well, so far we've all agreed on everything. However, we've had different takes on different things, but at least our tiering's been agreed upon. I think we can now move on to something I think we'll probably have a little bit of a disagreement on. We can move into Northern Realms, and we'll start with Shield Wall. So, how do we all think? What do we think about Shield Wall? Inferns, do you want to start on Shield Wall?
Right. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting. The matchups feel kind of weird across the board. So Nilfgaard didn't get hit much, which means Shield Wall is probably not going to be great. I'd probably put it in C tier as well, just because I expect Nilfgaard to be pretty good, and it does not fare well against Nilfgaard. Unless you have like perfect draws, you draw your assault round 1, you can bleed round 2, get out the ball. It's very hard to win that matchup, I feel. And so I put it in C tier, expecting Nilfgaard to be good.
Okay. And Redrame?
Yeah, I thought that I would have the hot take here, considering that I'm talking to Team Paj's team. I would. If you were hoping for disagreement, honestly, I think that is largely my train of thought. I don't think it's as hopeless against NG as is sometimes stated. I think with really good play and with good draws, you can try to pilot that matchup. But I think my issue with it is I just don't really see the strength. If Kelly is just everyone's fourth faction, then there is at least sort of an argument for it. But I think Witchers are just too premium of a deck. Like, Vesemir didn't get nerfed at all, and I thought that was one of the easier nerfs to make this time around. Just because it felt like the efficiency of that card in Northern Realms sort of obfuscates like any other possibility of running other decks. So I put it in C.
So yeah, I mean, I was expecting you to put it in C. I don't really know what I was expecting from Influence, but I think it's a little better. I think the fact that it's got a really good matchup into Kelly is nice. Obviously, I do think it will be bad into Nilfgaard. I think Nilfgaard is a bad matchup for it. But I also think it's got a good matchup into Witches. I think Witches is kind of a coin dependent matchup because you do need to win round 1. But say you win round 1, you just take the long round and you win every time pretty much. You just play your defender, they can't do anything, and then you just hold all your Visor Go to charges and play a Tridum, and then you end up winning with your jewels and stuff. And it's pretty much comes down to, can you win round 1? And Shield Wall generally wins round 1 more often than not against against Witches. Coin will matter because obviously that Griffin Witcher can be a problem. You have to draw a jewel round 1, preferably Prince to deal with it. But I think it's got a pretty good matchup into Witches, which is nice. And then Scoia'tael isn't too bad for it. But obviously the Nilfgaard thing does hurt it a bit. I would probably put it in B, but with both of you saying C, I'm more than happy to leave it in C and leave it at that. That seems okay by me.
B isn't crazy. It's definitely, if I had to rank the decks that are in C, I would easily give it the highest rating. It seems like the deck that's most likely to actually be playable next month out of the 3. I sort of view it more as just being too overshadowed by Witchers.
I can see that to an extent. I think Witches will be played a lot more, which is what we'll move on to next. And how do we feel about Witches? We can start with Redrame on this one.
I would give Witchers an A, personally. I think that, in theory, if we were going off of like last month's theory crafting, when y'all made the last tier list was like right around when Aluha sort of more casual season, of course, but Aluha just went on a crazy streak with Witchers because I think everyone was playing Nilfgaard just because the deck had a lot of points, and it was a natural way to beat Vi while still playing a really strong deck. And obviously Vi, kind of just blew people's minds that it existed. So from that perspective, I think going off of that theory crafting, you would say, okay, it beats Nilfgaard, and these are the 2 unearthed factions that are very strong right now. It must be crazy good on ladder. But the problem I have with that is that I think the longer people have been playing Witchers versus Nilfgaard, the more often Nilfgaard has won. I think early on I saw a lot of people invoing Erlin. I saw a lot of people just playing round 1 very passively when they had good hands that potentially could yoink round 1 away from Witchers. And there are a lot of ways for Nilfgaard to win the round 1, since the combinations of locks and engines matches pretty well into the lock targets and point slam cards that you'll find in the Witcher deck. And then even if you lose round 1, you can potentially just mulligan ball out of your hand and defend a bleed with Ramon and Brabins and have pretty good odds of picking up a ball in round 3. Obviously not a perfect plan. You would prefer to win round 1. But I think that there are a lot more strategies. And I think that this deck also struggles a lot against like elves and movement. And just some of the other decks in the meta a little bit too much for me to feel comfortable giving it an S.
Okay. Infants?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with the A tier. I think it has some pretty solid matchups across the board, but I would say that it isn't like a cut above everything else. I think it's just a really solid deck. I would say definitely NR's best pick. I'd say it's definitely got better matchups than Shield Wall. I'm happy with it.
Okay, so I think I would probably be leaning towards the bottom end of S tier, simply because I do think it is favoured into Nilfgaard. Depending on how favoured into Nilfgaard is probably up for debate, but I think with good draws from both players, Northern Realms will generally win that matchup. But again, I have not played it that much this season, so maybe Redrame has a better take on that than me. As well as the like movement decks and stuff, then sure, I think last season maybe, but with the nerfs to Justice and stuff, they're going to get quite a bit weaker. They lose a bit of that like tempo play that they can do. I can see it becoming a better matchup again for NR. And I just don't see anything that can really compete with the Witcher deck in terms of overall power throughout the meta. It just seems like it's not got any terrible matchups, and a lot of matchups it's actually favoured in. So I would probably be leaning towards S tier personally. But I don't mind putting it in top of A tier as well. Like it's kind of just like nitpicking here at this point. But I think I could see Witchers being the best overall deck next season, at least in terms of against the whole field. Maybe not necessarily from absolute power level, but at least from its matchup spread.
I guess one more point based on what we already have here. If we do think Kelly will be overtaking Vi and will be required as one of the 4 factions, I think that is the worst matchup for Witchers by a pretty good margin. It's like another possible concern I would have with putting it in S.
That is probably true, to be fair. I think Kelly is a bad matchup for Witchers. And I can see it being an A tier deck if Kelly is super popular. So moving on, I guess we go with Skelliga. So with Skelliga, we've got Lippy. Can start with Lippy. Now Lippy got a 2 provision buff last patch, and now they've taken away those 2 points basically. Taking away 1 provision and then 1 point. So not a lot else has changed in Lippy. I guess they've also nerfed Kadoosh, right? Which is actually that's pretty big, to be fair. That's another 2 points, potentially 4 with Lippy if they can replay it. They don't generally replay Kadoosh, but at the same time it is in theory possible. I think Lippy's going to be pretty poor this season. I didn't think Lippy was particularly great before, but some people have had good scores with it. You can go on good runs, you can queue good matchups, get good coin, but it's going to be even harder now, right? Those good matchups become less, and you can abuse coin a little worse, and you just lose a bit of points, right? And Lippy is all about points, and losing points is obviously bad for Lippy. So I think Lippy's actually going to potentially go into C. I don't think it's going to be any better than Shield Wall personally. So I think I would probably stick it in C, but I don't know what you guys think.
So I kind of think it's actually going to be still a solid deck. I think the points hurt definitely, but I think the basic game plan should still work in the same way. It feels like games with Lippy aren't really close. You're hard winning round 1 or you're not. And same with round 2, round 3. So that while the points matter, I think it could still be fine, and it could just be a solid deck still. So I'd probably put it in B tier, but I don't think C is crazy either.
I think I personally would rate Lippy worse than Shield Wall, which would probably mean that I'm supposed to put it in C. Shield Wall is a bit of a weird case, because Shield Wall, I could see the argument for it being at a B tier in terms of raw power. It's kind of more just positioning plus the existence of the Witcher deck. Whereas with Lippy, I feel like Lippy seems kind of more objectively weak. I think losing 4 points is kind of not small for any deck. And I don't really think its positioning will be good either. It does well into Kelly, if we think Kelly will be around. But I wouldn't really say, oh yeah, Witchers and Nilfgaard. That makes me think Lippy. That seems, if anything, the opposite. I think Nilfgaard does really well against decks that are relying on Kaduk for points. And I think Lockdown can really annoy Lippy as well, given that the deck relies on the synergies with their leader. And Witchers, I think, just outpoint slams Lippy pretty hard already. And Lippy is just losing more points in that battle.
Okay. So you're happy? Did you want to move Shield Wall up, or did you want to keep these the same? Because you're basically the deciding vote on both of these.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure. Lippy, I am confident, belongs in C. Shield Wall is like, I don't know. Shield Wall is like tough.
We can come back to Shield Wall at the end.
We could come back to it.
Once we've done everything else, we can reevaluate.
I'm slowly being sort of sold on Shield Wall because I am remembering how strong that deck was, and I do think that I can see its matchup table being better. I'm probably tunneling too much on Nilfgaard, because the non-Nilfgaard matchup table actually looks pretty good with what we have so far. I could see it being B.
So moving on now, I guess we move on to Fish Flappers. This is a deck I've played 0 games with. However, I have played against it a few times. And I've got to say, like, when I first started playing against it, I was like, wow, that deck's got a lot of points. It can do a lot of, it's good round one. It's got some solid engines that can be difficult to deal with. But the more you play against it, the more you realise that if you win round one and you can bleed it, it starts to just fall apart. It's like, it struggles once it starts getting bled, at least by certain decks that are able to. From what I've seen, I haven't played it, so I'm not super confident with it. I think it's like probably around the same sort of power level as Lippy. Maybe a little bit better now because Lippy got these nerfs, but it never seemed to really grab me I think it was a deck that came on the scene and people didn't really know how to play against it, so got some good results then, and as people have adjusted to it, it seems to have fallen out of the meta again, and Warriors has taken over. So I'd probably leave it in C and be done with that, but I don't know what you guys who maybe have a bit more experience with the deck.
Yeah, so I also have no experience with this deck at all. I've barely played against it either. From what I have seen, I'd say it's a solid C tier deck. Like, it doesn't seem particularly powerful, it just seems okay. But yeah, I could see it maybe being the choice over Lippy, although I'd still favour Warriors if I was picking an SK deck.
I have a little bit of experience with the deck. I tried it once I saw Gravish doing well with it. Just because I really hated the other Skelliga decks at the time. And at the time, it did feel better than both Lippy and Warriors. The meta was a little bit different then from what it is now. And I do sort of agree that it sort of fell off for me the more I played it. To me, I think the points are there in this deck. It's more just the awkwardness of the distribution. If you're on red coin, you can commit the portal round 1 and feel good about it. But if you're on blue coin, you're forced to commit the portal, which is basically half of your deck. Or you're supposed to somehow win round 1 without committing the portal to really get good value out of it. Or play enough points and then pass and not get tempoed out. It just gets really weird. If you can play a portal and then play a priest in that same round and then get a good Getty round where you happen to draw the preachers, the deck actually does have a lot of points. But it does have to run quite a few support cards that are not really worth very many points, like the Ermion and sometimes the Grimace, which I ended up cutting. I got so frustrated with it. But if you cut it, the Nilfgaard matchup gets really bad, and so does stuff like Kelly can walk all over you, potentially. Colgrim as well. I think I agree with the C. I think, I was torn between a B and a C when I saw this deck, and I think if y'all's gut reaction is a C, I would probably be inclined to agree with that.
Okay. I mean, this is going a lot more smoothly than I anticipated so far.
Yeah.
But we do still have some of the more controversial, or at least not controversial, but more difficult decks to tier go forward. I think one of them will be Warriors, personally, because I have a feeling Redrame has a different opinion to me on this one. I tend to think that Warriors is SK's best deck, and I think, like, having played at least Ursine myself, it feels really, really solid. Feels like it has a lot of good matchups, or at least not bad matchups, right? Like close to 50-50, probably slightly favoured in my opinion. The Redrame's going to probably think they're slightly unfavoured, and that's why the tier list will change. But one thing I do think Warriors has is very unpolarised matchups. I think its matchups are never massively swingy one way or another, particularly. Kelly is pretty bad, I think. I think Kelly's just bad. I think that's its worst matchup, and it is pretty swingy in Kelly's favour. But generally speaking, I think Warriors is pretty solid. I personally think, from my experience having played it, it seems okay into Nilfgaard, but we can see what everyone else thinks about that. In terms of our Witches, I think that's a really good matchup for it. Like, I say really good, again, it's not like super polarized, but I think Warriors is favoured into Witches, so the more Witches you see, the better Warriors becomes. And I also think it's probably favoured against other SK decks. So I think it has like a reasonable position in the meta, but at the same time, it is losing points from Kadoosh, which is pretty impactful, and it doesn't have. It's not kind of not gained anything for several patches, right? So I'd be close to putting it in A, but I think I would put it in B. But I could, if one of you wanted to convince me it was A, I'd be happy to agree. But I have a feeling I'm going to be having to defend its B position here. So, Infants, do you want to go next?
I mean, I'm happy to call it a B tier deck as well. I think it's just solid, better than the other SK choices. It's just got a lot of control tools, a lot of points. Kadoosh hurts, obviously, the 2 points there. But I think it's still just solid points. It's just a good deck. No terrible matchups besides maybe Kelly. No great matchups either, but I feel like it's kind of one of those decks that if you're like a decent player as well, you can always kind of rely on having like being able to kind of outskill your opponent to win. But in general, I'd say it's just a solid deck. Good choice. B tier is fine.
And Mr.
Yeah, I think I
Redrame?
disagree with about everything said so far. I guess I'll go. I guess I'll try to go like most recent backwards because that's how my brain works. First of all, I don't think Warriors is really that much of a skill deck.
Okay.
I think the hands where you miss Blood Eagle, a lot of times you just get fucked. A lot of times the hands where you get like depending on whether you're going Patricide or Ursine, you're either trying to not get fucked on blue coin, or you're trying to fuck people over from red coin with tempo. And I feel like a lot of times if you miss the windows on those fronts, or your opponent doesn't play into like your blue boy or things on that nature, it can be a lot trickier to steal wins. It also does feel pretty matchup based, like depending on which deck you're playing. The one thing I will say, since I have to disagree with everything that y'all said, I don't actually think the Kelly matchup is that bad. If you're playing Patricide and you run Charge, it is deceptively okay. Like the more I've played it, the more I like the Warriors side of that matchup. I think the sort of Kelly rumor really got started because the first time Kelly really came onto the scene was when Warriors was Rage of the Sea, I think.
Yep.
And that deck just had absolutely no way to deal with Kelly. Mm-hmm. But the Patricide not only the Patricide can disable Kelly through tokens, and simultaneously encourages you to run one more Tall Answer. And the deck does have quite a lot of points, which is useful against a deck like Kelly that's really going like the round manipulation route. Like being able to save points is also quite strong, and that's something that Warriors can do, since Kelly is very likely to get into a position where it can full bleed you. And like a lot of times you can also just beat the Siri Dash. Like if you're on red coin, you can get ahead of them before they can actually leverage the card advantage, and then you can have enough stuff left where you're fine with just losing a card up. And you have removal for their engines. The bigger issues I see with Warriors, I guess as Chezzy predicted, I don't like the Witchers matchup. I don't like the Nilfgaard matchup. I feel like both of those go the other way. From what was said. And I think that losing Kadoosh points is actually a pretty big deal. I feel like that was really the only thing keeping Skellige up in terms of point values. If I had to appoint a 5th faction for this meta, it's kind of an unfair thing to do, given that the non-syndicate factions are all pretty viable right now, but I would call it Skellige. So Skellige being one of the factions that's getting nerfed. Yee. I will say that Vi was a big problem point for Skellige. And Vi being removed from the meta will help it a little bit. So I wouldn't call it like a low C, but I would, if it were my tiering, I would give it a C. But it's sort of in like the shield wall zone where it's like the deck is strong enough that you kind of have to respect it. But I wouldn't play this deck personally, and I feel like B is like where I would start to play this deck if I had to. I'm not convicted enough to give giving it a C that I would really try to argue for it being a C. But I do think that would be my opinion. Like,
Okay.
I'm fine with leaving it in B. It's not really, it's not by any means crazy. I think A is a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on now then. We can move on to Squirtle, I guess. We can move on to Squirtle. So a deck that I haven't seen too much of. I did play it a bit myself, and I know that Padge played a bit of this. I know he switched off it towards the end, but he did okay with it. I know Bart likes to play the Devotion version. There's a few people playing this sort of deck, and that's the Nature's Gift. Now, Nature's Gift is a funny one because there are two very different ways of building it, right? You can build it Devotion or non-Devotion, and depending on which way you do it, it does swing your matchups quite a bit one way or another. Having said that, I think this season we've seen more of the non-Devotion, but that could very well be because of Vi. Which makes me think that maybe Devotion will be more popular again next season, because I think at the start of the season Devotion was the more popular, and people just realised that you can't beat Vi with that. You basically just bend it over and saying have at it. So I think this season with Vi being out of the meta, you'll see a bit more of the Devotion, because it does have more points, right? Like you do get the Ithne, which does have some synergy in this deck. Having said that, I don't think Devotion or non-Devotion is particularly great. I think it's okay. It's got some points. You can tutor it for your specific meta and it can be okay, but I think it's one of the weaker options in Squirtle right now. And again, I'd probably be leaving this in either low B or high C personally. I don't know what you guys think.
I've never liked this deck personally. I think with Vi gone, it might be like the Devotion list might be a little bit better. I agree. But then again, Kelly is also going to be one of the biggest monsters of this, and if you're playing Devotion, that deck's not going to have a good time, I feel like. So, yeah, I would just say it's a solid C tier deck. Like, it's okay, but
Even the non-Devotion list struggles against Kelly. I'm not actually sure what this deck is really aiming to beat. It's been one of my biggest problems with this deck this month. Like in the past, Nature's Gift just really had points, and there was also a lot of like Skelliga was like really up there, and I think Skelliga is one of the better matchups for Nature's Gift in general relative to the other ST leaders. Just being able to play a Hamadryad at 6, not playing that many units into like the boats and having rebukes and things of that sort, being able to bleed and going for like a last say gourd, a lot of ability to win on even. I also think this deck probably loses the most from the Justice change, in the sense that there's absolutely no hope for running Justice in this deck anymore. Like I think I could definitely see like some of the elf decks trying for it. And I could maybe see like some of the movement decks trying for it. But I think this deck has too much else going on to really say, oh yeah, I'm just going to play a dwarf and then play Justice. And this deck really struggled to make tokens more than some of the other ST lists do. Like if you're playing elves, the fact that Justice can play extra units can be nice, but sometimes it's even a hindrance if you're in the long round. Whereas this deck really felt like it needed the units in order to play stuff like Gezrus, which feels like one of the biggest reasons to play ST right now. So I would just give it a C. Didn't like the deck now, and I don't see why it would get better.
Okay. Moving on. We can go for Madoc next. So Madoc's a funny one, right? It like hit the scene and everyone was like, oh my god, this deck is absolutely broken. It's got like, I think Adskov got like 25-50 in like the first few days with it, and it was like, oh, this deck, it can't lose, it has good matchups into everything. And then people realised that that isn't actually true. There's plenty of things you can do against Madoc to make it awkward for it. Just discard a bunch of cards and watch them discard a bunch of cards, and eventually they have to pass, and then you just play some catch up on red and things like that. And yeah, I think it caught people by surprise. People weren't expecting it to be as good as it was when it first came out, but people have adjusted to it, and it kind of fell out of the meta again. Like elves came up and those sort of things. One of the things I think that hurt Madoc was everybody assumed it would be good into Vi, right? But it actually isn't. Losing like the Sheldon package probably helps a bit in that Vi matchup, because if you were running it without the Madoc, you have that Sheldon package, you can get a huge Sheldon then plays for a lot of points, things like that. But I'm not even sure the Sheldon package is good into Vi. I'm not sure. I haven't played it too much, but the Madoc deck definitely got, I think that was one of its biggest drawbacks, was it was supposed to be good into Vi and it wasn't. Kelly wasn't particularly popular, which would be a good matchup for it. And then everything else kind of just adjusted to play around it. Having said that, with Vi gone now, it shouldn't be so bad as well with Lippy getting nerfed. I think those are two bad matchups gone for it. So going forward, you've got NR, which is probably Witches, which is probably a sort of bad matchup. Nilfgaard's a funny one. I think it comes down to basically who can win round one, so who has like the better playable hand. Generally, I guess it'd probably be Nilfgaard, but I could see Madoc being okay into Nilfgaard, as it can be very like awkward for both players in that matchup. However, one thing I will say is I think that the Justice nerf will absolutely really, really hurt this deck, because not being able to go Justice for points is very painful. Having thought about that actually makes me think it is actually worse than I first thought, because Justice was such a big part for this deck. I think the Justice nerf alone probably drops it down to C, because a lot of the time what you do with Madoc, right, is you basically either discard or just kill everything, and then when they pass you play Justice to catch up, or you hold Justice for round 3 for actual points, because you have no points in round 3 without Justice. Justice and Gord were literally your only points in that deck, and with those gone, it's kind of sad. So I think I'm going to put it in C, having thought about it a bit more, even though I think the meta's probably better for it this patch. The fact that it's lost Justice is a huge deal.
I mean, yeah, that deck only played 3 points cards: Justice, the Tree, and Gord, right? They were the only points cards in the deck, and you've lost one of them. Like you can't reliably pull Justice off anymore. You're meant to go kind of unitless, right? You don't want to have to play a Pyrotech to then play your tempo card. Like it's just gonna be so rough. I feel like I would say C tier as well.
I would go one step further to say that I don't even think the meta improved for this deck. The Vi matchup isn't as good as you want it to be, but I do actually think the Madoc package helps relative to like other hand buff STs. Like Madoc in round 1 can actually get you a round 1, which can be a big deal, or potentially get you a tempo pass or something of that nature. And with 3 tall removals, it is possible to win that matchup. I've seen it happen. You just have to play the deck very well and have the Vi deck. Yeah, it's tough. Vi's pretty good, but my bigger problem with this deck is that its best matchup is Warriors. And I think Warriors are going to start shitting the bed. So I think Madoc is really going to start shitting the bed. And like, given that this deck right now would be like somewhere between a B and a C, it has had a little bit of a resurgence. I've seen a few people playing it like in the last couple of days. Like, I would almost be tempted to throw this in the Congregate bucket. I feel like it becomes a completely different deck without Justice. But I don't know. It's probably not quite Congregate level.
The biggest selling point to Matic is it's not quite Congregate level.
Yeah.
To be fair, that's a selling point.
Also, the bombs are getting buffed. The bombs getting buffed is actually kind of big.
Yeah.
Maybe that saves it a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd say C tier is fair.
Low end of C tier, I think.
Yeah.
Which new bombs do we think Matic will be playing? Like D-Bomb, I would assume for sure, but is there like any chance Dancing Star will be played? I could see it, honestly.
I could see Red Haze being played depending on the meta, right? Like it's...
Wait, is Red Haze... What happened to Red Haze? I don't
Isn't
remember.
Red Haze 4P now as well?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh. That could... Someone played a 20-point Red Haze against me this month.
Oh, no.
Were you playing
I was
Vi by
playing
any
Vi,
chance?
and that's
Mr.
how you
Redrame?
beat Vi with this deck or something.
Play Red Haze, genius.
Double Red
Not
Haze.
what I meant earlier,
Yeah.
as to like how this deck can beat Vi.
Yep.
So now you have 5 tool punish Pog.
But yeah, like I said, I think like the bomb package is getting stronger, but I think the Justice nerf just kind of makes this deck not playable, kind of. Having said that, the bomb package getting a buff means that potentially Nilfgaard Matic could see some experimentation potentially.
Justice is also just a really, really powerful spell. Like it fits the Gourd so well.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's kind of an extra point in this deck because the card you would be running that's not Justice is probably a unit.
Mm-hmm. True.
Although I don't even know what that would be.
Yeah.
It's hard, man. I was already playing Knickers in this deck because I was just at a loss for golds to play. And now
you
it's
just put in
losing
your
Justice.
Ragnarok, right? You just...
Yeah, I ran Knickers and Ragnarok.
Yeah. Well, the standard list can now run Ragnarok instead of Justice is fine.
Yeah, it's fine.
Happy smile.
Okay, moving on. I'm not sure which one. So are we saying Gezrus is the movement and this one is
Just point slam elves.
Point Slam Elves? Don't Point Slam Elves use Gezrus too though? Just no movement engines?
Yeah, my list runs Gezrus, and I think that's the one I've seen other people using the most.
So this is a little confusing. This is the...
Yeah, it is a little confusing. I think that's meant to
Okay.
be elves.
Yeah, this one's
because
Elves, so we'll do Elves.
The other one doesn't play Isengrim always. The other one,
Yeah.
like if we're talking OG movement, the other one plays Gaten.
Yeah. Okay.
But some people started cutting it for Isengrim, just deciding it was better.
Mhm.
And then I kind of went one step further and just cut the other movement cards that weren't Gezrus.
Yeah. There's kind of like a whole like you can there's like a stage, there's your deck and then there's the original deck and there's a number of like changes you can make in between. Like you can start just cutting the Gaetan, then you can start cutting the movement engines, and then you can start playing Curse of Corruption, you know. There's the whole range of things you can do.
So where do we think Elves is going to position itself? I think Elves is better than Warriors. The question is, do we think it's as good as Witches and Kelly? Again, the Justice nerf is going to hurt. There's no denying Justice hurts all of these decks. Now, you can probably get away with it with still running it with double Pyrotech. Generally, Pyrotech sticks because it's a 6 and you don't really want to damage it. So, Pyrotechs generally stick. The problem is you have to have a Pyrotech in the hand where in the round that you want to play your Justice as well, which can be a bit awkward. But other than that, I don't think Scoia'tael got... Oh, it also got a nerf to its Cat Witches, but this one doesn't run Cat Witches. So I think this one probably is an A, but I think it's maybe the bottom of these 3 A decks so far. I think Scoia'tael's pretty good, but it has got a few nerfs this patch, so I'm not sure. Really not sure.
I personally would put... Oh, sorry.
No, after you.
I personally would put this deck in between Witchers and Kelly. I think this deck is still going to be better than Kelly. I would call it the third faction going into next month by default. Right now, I would argue this is the second best deck in the game after Nilfgaard. And I think it has a really good matchup table into a meta where Nilfgaard, Witchers, and Kelly are likely to be the decks. You could argue that right now it is favored against all 3 of those. The question is kind of just how much will losing Justice hurt it.
An infants?
So, I think it definitely at least one Squirtle deck out of the two we got left are going in A tier for sure. Now, I think if you're saying Lockdown, Witches, and Kelly are going to be the other good decks, then against Lockdown and Kelly, you're probably going to want the Curse of Corruption, no engine version, right? Whereas against Witches, I'd probably say you want the more engine focused one. So at the end of the day, I'd say, okay. And I think that the non-engine variant is much better into Kelly and much better into Nilfgaard. So I'd have to give it to the whole serum, put it in A tier as well, I think.
So I think we're all agreed on A tier. It's just whereabouts in these things, and I think it's going to come down to finding the right time to play all of these decks at the right times and things. But I think we're pretty happy with these three all being A tier at the moment.
Yeah.
And then we move on to the movement deck. Now, movement deck was the most popular one. It made a lot of sense, right? These new cards came out. People wanted to play these cards. Then it seemed to fall out of the meta a little bit. Madoc came along. People started playing Madoc. And then towards the end of the season, Elves came back. The other problem with the movement deck was people weren't playing it with Deadeye. People were playing it with all sorts of different leaders. And I think Deadeye is the strongest leader for Squirtle right now, right? The Elf package is just really strong. Like, you have that core combo of cards that is really, really strong. In terms of the movement package, the engines, honestly, with Nilfgaard's probably bad for it. Kelly's also probably bad for it. I could see it probably being favoured in the mirror. So in the Squirtle mirror, the engine version's possibly favoured. Because Curse is doing pretty much nothing in that matchup. And I think against NR Witches, engines are always useful. Like, they can't really deal with engines, so it seems okay. I'd also put this in A tier. I think it's got a few... it's worse into Kelly and Nilfgaard, but it's probably better into the other two. And then the rest of the field it's probably fine into, right? Like, I mean, Warriors it's probably worse into, which is the other B tier deck at the moment. But everything else is kind of irrelevant at this point, right? Like, it beats most of the other decks, which is why they're so low.
I'm gonna put my foot down here.
Okay.
Okay. This is interesting because now we have Warriors in B. I was tempted to say this deck belongs in C tier. Going into next meta, but I can't. See, now this is where because I sort of slightly disagree with the Warriors placement. Like, I can't justify calling this deck worse than Warriors going into next month, really. But I do think that it is already worse than the other deck, and I think that with the changes being made going into next month, the other deck only makes more sense relative to this deck. Like, we're seeing the biggest problem with the movement engines is they just hard throw your Nilfgaard matchup. Catwitcher is actually just the best Nilfgaard card. Additionally, Catwitcher is getting nerfed. Additionally, Kelly is going to be the monster deck of choice, and having another tall removal there is absolutely massive. It's just very difficult for me to see why you would ever play this deck over the other one. And I feel like it's roughly where Shield Wall is, because I feel sort of similarly about it to Shield Wall in that in terms of raw power it's like B tier, but also I would never play this deck. And I feel like it is possible for there to be a deck that I would consider playing that's like at that power level.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it sort of comes down to tier semantics a little bit in terms of, like, what do you want B tier to mean versus what do you want C tier to mean.
Do you not think that the movement deck is favoured into the mirror?
I do not think the movement deck is favored into the mirror. You can, like... The Elves give you surprisingly decent control. Like, you really only have to kill the Dolbathanas, and you do hard stack a row for Catwitcher. It's, like, not the worst like, obviously the Curse of Corruption is not great for the mirror, but it can kill something of value, especially if you end up being red coin. Just taking a Curse of Corruption on like a TA Doblathana can be really strong. Although if they don't use the TA, for some reason people always use the TA, and that might skew my opinion a little bit. I don't really get why in that matchup. Although Bowman can obviously put a lot of pressure on Doblathana if you don't use the tack on it. Or the skull, whichever one they're running.
Okay.
Like, it's probably slightly okay into the mirror. That is a valid point. That's probably a legitimate enough point to where this deck is solidly B tier.
And influence?
So I think you're basically taking a very similar deck and changing its matchup spread quite a lot, right? So you're making Nilfgaard significantly worse with the engines. You're making Kelly a bit worse and not having Curse of Corruption. I'd be tempted to put it in B tier. I think it is probably worse in its matchups than the Elves list. But I don't think it's significantly worse. I think it's quite a bit worse, but just because of that Nilfgaard matchup and the Kelly matchup, I guess. But I think the Elves matchup and the Witches matchup is enough to keep it like just below the Elf.
I've been convinced we can put it in B tier. Okay, now moving on to the final faction. My personal favourite faction historically, but right now my least favourite faction because fuck Cloggers, fuck card manipulation, all those stupid mentors and alchemists and things. Screw those cards, please, for the love of God. CDPR, make Nilfgaard fun again, and not make me want to turn my game off every time I queue into that nonsense and they steal my Vi or they steal my Neuromancy or my Haunt or my whatever it is. They keep stealing stuff and I keep getting mad, and yeah, it's upsetting. So I guess in that vein we might as well talk about Cloggers first, as I've just ranted and raved for a little bit. Now this is a difficult one because it does depend on 1, the meta, 2, the version of Cloggers you're playing, and 3, probably the pilot, because I think Cloggers is actually a deck where you need to be able to play it reasonably well yourself. You can't just go, oh, I'm playing Cloggers, I should just be able to win with my huge Colgrim, because you actually have to be able to get that Colgrim going. I've seen a lot of people play it and they just like, oh, this deck's rubbish, and then you see somebody like Shaggy play it and go on a 10-game win streak because he plays it properly, and then people are like, oh, this deck's broken, and I think it's actually somewhere in the middle. You actually play it well, you'll win some games because people will play badly against you, but you play it badly and you'll lose all your games because, I mean, you're playing the deck badly and it actually struggles if you play it badly. So I think Cloggers, depending on the version you play and depending on the meta, could potentially, like, you can go on really good streaks with this if you queue the right matchups and queue bad players and things, but at the same time I don't think it actually is that good, so I'd probably put it in the B. Nova seems to be the one that most people have got their best scores with. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best version, it's just the one that caught people off guard and didn't know how to play against necessarily the best. But I don't think Colgrim as a deck is quite at the A tier level. However, it is a deck that can always be considered due to its kind of the nature of the beast, the way it plays, and how difficult it can be to both pilot and play against. Redrame, do you have any follow-ups on that?
Yeah, I'm struggling a lot with Cloggers. I have some experience with the deck, but it's fairly limited. Yeah. God, it's yet another one of those awkward decks where it's like, why would you ever play this over ball? To me, the thing that confuses me the most about Cloggers is I'm not really sure what its matchup spread is. I think largely the deck depends on the opponent not having full access to their tools, because right now pretty much almost every deck can dismantle Cloggers with a good draw. And that makes the deck really hard to rate. It's kind of just a question of how often does it do that. Mm-hmm. I personally feel like it fell off harder than Battle Trance. It reminds me a lot of Battle Trance in the sense of there was one day where everyone thought it was really, really good. I have seen more people playing it, though, still, than Battle Trance, which might be worth something. can I really say it's better than Shield Wall and Gift? I feel like those decks stand up on their own a little bit more than this one. I'd be tempted to give it a C. Like,
that's okay. And
yeah.
Infants?
I really dislike this deck. I'm not sure how I rate its power, but I hate how, like...
Yeah, that's what I'm
on...
scared of, is it's like, I want this deck to be a D.
Yeah,
I
like...
want this deck to be
No, I
worse
don't want
than
this deck on our
Congregate.
tier list. I want it banished to the Shadow Realms.
Yeah, like... No deck depends so heavily on your opponent's round 1 hand. Like, it's like... Especially if they just don't draw a Nairo in their round 1 hand, then they just lose access to the rest of their like answers for your Colgrim the rest of the game, and it's just you just win. Like I hate it. Like,
It's probably got a fairly 50-50 matchup then, right? Because like 50% of the time you draw a card in round 1, right? Is generally how it works.
Yeah.
it's 50-50. You either win or you don't. You know.
The issue is I've just yet to find a matchup where I'm like sad to queue into the deck because I think I'm unfavored. I'm always just sad to queue into the deck because it's the deck.
Yeah.
But that might just be because your overall overriding feeling is I'm just sad to queue into this, so you're just like, oh yeah, I'm just sad in general.
Yeah. Ladder is pain.
Yeah.
Can we make a separate tier which is just like this shit, like below Congregate, and just hope it ends up there?
I think something like Witches will probably struggle into it, right? Like, because it doesn't have an answer. At least to
Witchers
the
are pretty
renewed
good at
version.
drawing their cards.
They are.
Witchers, I actually think, are one of the best counters to this deck. If you're running a tall remove, like if you're running Bloody Baron, if you run Geralt, you can get Stonewalled by Fion, which is not good. And if you're running like Prince on Sace or something of that nature, I'm not really sure what it's doing against this deck. I guess Yrden. The other option if you wanted to beat this deck. And God, I hate playing Yrden in that deck. I hate Yrden in general. I don't want to think of Yrden. But there are, like, this deck I think of, if we're talking the Nova version and not the all-in version, which it sounds like we are because that's what most people are playing. I consider that deck to not be a Colgrim deck. I consider it to be a Viper Witcher Mentor deck. It feels like most of the time the Colgrim is just a much answer Viper Mentor. That is meant to make your opponent squirm in terms of I have to save these cards for Colgrim and it's painful because I'm being clogged and my hand doesn't have that many options. And so from that perspective, like, the Viper Witcher Mentors are often only worth like 6 or 7 points against Witchers, and you're playing 3 of them every game. Like, if you draw Natalis Aurier and you draw like 2 of the 4 Erlins and Vesemirs, like, what's left in your deck?
Yeah,
a lot of times nothing. Like, I've usually won that matchup with Witchers.
Right? But yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I don't know. I agree. I think this deck's very hard to tier, right? Just simply because it's like matchups don't. It's not necessarily the matchup dependent on the deck. It's the matchup dependent on the hand round 1, right? And that's like, so it's kind of hard to tier because if you draw your answers round 1, you're probably fine whatever deck you're playing. But how often
playing it's tricky. Playing against it's tricky. I feel like playing against it is trickier than playing it personally. I feel like a lot of people make mistakes against this deck and just don't deny targets when they can. Sometimes even hard denying targets, but even just like soft denying, like sequencing your plays to make it very awkward for your opponent to use their Viper Witchers and not just give you free clogs on like random tokens and things of that nature.
Yep.
So it is difficult to rate. It's between a B and a C for sure. I wouldn't be offended by either placement, but I don't know. My mind would be happier if it was a C because, God, I hate this deck. And God, I would not ladder this deck. It's so inconsistent.
We can put it in C to try and bait people into not playing it. I like that.
I like that plan. Like, I guess the real argument for C, are we tiering from the perspective of a good player, or are we tiering from the perspective of raw strength? Because I think raw strength, it might be a B, but it sort of has that Vi effect, right? Where it's like, the games you win are going to be more dependent on your cues and your hands and things of that nature. Like, I sort of disagree with, like obviously you do have to play the deck well, but I sort of disagree that it's like, oh yeah, people were playing it poorly, and that's why the deck was bad, and then suddenly it was good. Like, it's still very matchup-y.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I want it in C. Please don't put it in B.
Okay, we've put it in C. And, in fact, what we should do is just get rid of it. Can I
delete
take it off
yeah.
the... No, apparently I can't get rid of it, so I guess it has to go into C.
Yeah, we don't have a Kingslayer in this tier list. We need Mill to delete the Cloggers.
Yeah, feels bad. Alright, moving on now, we have Assimilate. So I'm assuming Redrame just wants to put it in S, right? So and be done with it. We just leave it there. Everyone,
let's go.
Everyone just play Assimilate. Let's go. No, I think
Assimilate too. I'm surprised they didn't do
season.
anything to Angolim. Real talk.
I think
that card is just silly.
What, the Angolim?
Oh, they did. They nerfed it by 2 points.
Oh, they did. Oh, this deck is dead as fuck.
Oh no,
Why
I
did you
mean
play the
from Kadush.
Oh, true. True. I mean, yeah, honestly, when I built this deck, it was kind of just to farm the shit out of Skelligas and to farm other Nilfgaards. And I feel like over time, the Nilfgaards are not as farmable as I've wanted them to be. And the Skelligas, I mean, my hypothesis is that Skelliga is going to suffer a lot this patch. So Assimilate losing its best matchup is kind of... I thought y'all underrated it last month, but this month I would genuinely put it in C for sure.
I think the deck feels very much like Fish Flappers, honestly. Like, it kind of has that massive explosive, like, similar to Getty, your Assimilate engines can get out of control, but again on Blue Coin, you're going to feel a bit iffy committing things like the Portal and not getting much out of it. I mean, you get the round, which obviously, like, in a lot of matchups just wins you the game if you can do that, but it still feels kind of sometimes. Like,
yeah,
it feels weird committing stuff and then not getting, like, much out of it.
I think the biggest problem with Assimilate right now is if you're playing the Angolim version, you've got NR and you've got Kelly, and you're not getting anything out of either of them, and then that matchup is basically unwinnable from that point, right? Like, you play this 3 for 10, and it's just like, well, go next, I guess. Like, it's so sad when that happens. It's really bad. And Elves, I mean, most of them are running Feign Death now, which is good, because at the start of last season they weren't, so that makes that matchup a bit better. But I'm not even sure it's a good matchup, even if you hit the Feign Death.
I think it probably is.
Yeah, I could see.
It's a lot better if they're movement. Like, Assimilate, I think, abuses movement even harder than Lockdown to some extent. Like, you have that many more informants.
Yeah, true. But I tend to agree. I think it's a C deck. I basically just don't see it seeing any play this season. It's one of the main issues with the deck, right? Like, why would you play this over Ball? Which is funny, right? They decided, right, Ball's obviously... Ball's the best card in the game. Let's put it to 15 provisions. Nobody will pay 15 provisions for that card. And then you just... everybody still pays 15 provisions and doesn't feel bad about it because... Spoiler alert, the card was massively overtuned before, and it's still probably too good, but there we go.
Yeah. I was kind of hoping they would, like, maybe tackle it now.
Yeah, I
was kind of hoping they would maybe tackle, like, any of the Nilfgaard cards.
Yeah, they got a lot of decent top-end cards, which is what we're going to move on to now with Nilfgaard Ball. So, with Nilfgaard Ball, you have... It's got... generally, people are playing Lockdown, right? Lockdown's the leader of choice at the moment. Reason being is I think all the other Nilfgaard leaders are kind of just don't do anything, right? Like, your leader's never trading up on your opponent's leader in Nilfgaard, which is why you just play Lockdown and say, well, we trade even, and you lose all your synergies, which is makes up for the provisions most of the time. There are obviously matchups where that isn't the case. Elves being one of the main offenders there. It's probably bad into that, but generally speaking, Nilfgaard struggles in terms of having any good leader, so Lockdown's pretty good against these highly synergistic leaders like Uprising, Shield Wall, if that was ever popular. It's not particularly. Vi was the obvious one that it used to really do well into. But yeah, I think Lockdown. I mean, people seem to be doing really well with it again towards the end of the season. It wasn't doing particularly well at the start of the season, but seems like people are doing a lot better again now with Lockdown. And the deck just has a lot of points. It's probably its biggest weakness is round 1. But I mean, it's got some potential in round 1, right? And you can commit things round 1 depending on the matchup. So you just depend on whatever matchup you're into, and you decide whether you need to commit your Breathins, your Ramon, those sort of cards round 1, or if you just want to pass and try and defend the bleed with them. I definitely could. I think it's probably A tier. I have a feeling Redrame's going to argue that it's S tier and better than all the others. But I think these 4 decks are all somewhat like interchangeable depending on the day's meta or whatever. So I think I'm probably going to leave it in A, and we'll see what the other guys think. Infants?
I'm confident that I'd put it at. Sorry.
I'll let go Redrame go. Yeah.
Okay.
I keep doing that. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
I'm confident that Lockdown is the best of those 4 decks. I'm not sure whether I'd put it in A or S. Like, fuck it, I'd put it in S. It's true, I would. I would do that. I'm that kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
That's my argument.
So
okay, but
so
real talk, the Lockdown... I tried playing this deck with Double Cross a while ago, and honestly, the biggest problem with it was that the 7 provisions didn't do shit. Like, I tried it at a time where the 7 provisions kind of did shit because Matic was a lot more popular, and I was like, ooh, I could run a Menno to reliably have my coup, and then also play Amnesty, and it would be really good against Matic, and there were a lot of Lippies at the time, too. And so it felt kind of good. And then I kind of realized that Amnesty was just kind of shit, and that whenever you kind of drew your coup, running Tactics felt kind of awful. And then Witchers got a lot more popular again, and I hated playing 3-point leaders. It's just generally not ideal. You have to work so hard to make Double Cross not a 3-point leader in that matchup.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and the other Nilfgaard leaders are just like painfully bad. Maybe Formation is better than I don't know. It's really not. Who am I kidding? Why can't Nilfgaard have real leaders? Why are their cards so overtoned? Just give us some leaders, man. Nerf some cards. Works for all the other factions.
Yeah.
But yeah. God. I don't want a Lockdown deck to be the best deck in the game, but I do think it is.
It's kind of the opposite to Shield Wall, right? Like, all the Shield Wall's cards are, they're okay. They're, like, not great, but then Shield Wall just makes them good.
Yeah.
Whereas Lockdown's like, all their cards are great, but the leaders are useless.
What I will say is Lockdown, I think, is easily the best deck that didn't get nerfed, but if you go for, like, one level up from there, if we look at the other decks we put in A tier, it's not super convincing that this deck will, like, dominate the game. Like, Witchers, Elves, and Kelly all have game plans against Lockdown that make some amount of sense. Like, I think the decks that Lockdown beat down the most, ironically, in my opinion, were the Skelliga decks. And the Skelliga decks got worse. It just felt like whenever you got red coin, you just won, and whenever you got blue coin, quite often you could survive against things like Lippy. Just being able, like, just the Nilfgaard golds matched very well into them. Ramon was really, really annoying for Warriors. Brovins was really, really annoying for Kaduk. It's just a dominant long round. Yeah. I think I would put it at top of A. I think top of A is fine. I don't think there has to be an S tier deck.
I mean, it's good if there isn't an S tier deck. That's what you want from a meta.
Yeah.
And Infants?
Right, so I think if you look at the 4 decks we have in A tier currently, trying to decide which one is like a potential replacement for Warriors, I'd say the Ball is the least likely one you got to cut for playing Skelliga instead. So like by that, I could see it being better than the other 3 and potentially going to S, but I don't think it's like better enough to go to S.
So I think my biggest problem with Ball here, and I think this is where me and Redrame disagree, and I guess he's got more more experience this season, but generally I think it's actually unfavored into all three of these other A tier decks. Like, I think NR Witches has always been good into it, and that's why it came along. I think Kelly's slightly favored into it because like there's not a lot you can really do as Nilfgaard against. Like, Phantom's really strong. They've got like Dash you have to answer kind of, and then you've obviously you need to draw your answer to Defender round 1. If you don't draw your answer to Defender round 1, it can be very awkward. It does sort of come down to hands, and I think it is kind of a skill based matchup because both decks are pretty hard to play. But I think Kelly's generally at least okay into Lockdown, and then Elves is probably also favoured into Lockdown, which is why I don't think it's S tier, and I honestly just think it's around the same sort of power level. I think NR Witches is top at the 4, personally, but I think they're all pretty close in terms of power level. Maybe Kelly's the weakest of the 4, sorry. But...
I think those 4 are definitely solidly A. I think it's... You can make an argument for any one of them being, besides maybe Kelly being the best.
I don't think you can argue for Elves being the just without Justice. I think we're without the Justice change, at least, whether you cut Justice or not.
Yeah,
I can see that.
Yeah.
I think it's very clearly not Elves and not Kelly. I think you could make an argument for Witchers if you really wanted to, but I would argue that Witchers have a worse Kelly matchup than Lockdown, while also being... Witchers lose to Kelly a lot harder than Lockdown does. Witchers kind of lose to Lockdown on the 1v1 from my experience, which I think is where Chezzy disagrees with me the most, probably. And then Witchers are pretty bad into Elves as well. Which, I mean, I think both Witchers and Lockdown gain quite a bit from the Elf matchup improving. Like, to me, I think without Justice being as good as it was, Lockdown probably more solidly wins the long round, which is really good because that was the best you could do as Lockdown. As Lockdown, you were never going to push Elves really successfully. Like, it's just not a thing you wanted to do. And you did have some ways to win round 1, but it felt like if you spent like a single committal-ish gold, suddenly the Elf deck might just have enough raw value to get there. Like, I think in a 10v10 where like you just have Nilfgaard golds against Elf golds, the Nilfgaard golds barely win. Like, there are a lot of tricks to manipulate some of the Elf golds. Like, you can fill a row against Gezrus. There's a lot of stuff you can do with spies that's pretty sneaky. But it is very, very close, and it could come down to positioning. Like, it might be a last say sort of game. It might be... Like, I feel like without Justice, you're just a little more comfortable there as Nilfgaard. And it's not super obvious how Elves push Nilfgaard either, because it's like if they lead scenario, you can lead your scenario, and sure, they get to Heatwave it. But you can still get a lot of points off of that Dame, and you can, like, poison the Commando. And like you usually can take plays from that position. It's not the worst position ever, and without a Justice, they lose quite a bit of their pushing game. I'm still pretty convinced it's the best.
That's fair.
But overall, I'm pretty happy with how this went. I don't know if you guys saw, but I sneakily put Shield Wall up into B.
Yeah, no, I agree.
The more we
honestly,
were
with how many
it,
decks we have in C,
yeah.
I think Shield Wall is a more respectable deck than these other decks. I would sort of agree.
Yeah.
I'd maybe put Colgrim to the top of C. I think Colgrim's just played more.
Yeah.
Like, these two are probably pretty close to B and B as well, I think. Like, they will see some amount of play. But yeah, overall, I'm pretty happy. I could see Vi also being a D. Depends on... It's kind of neat to see where it is.
Like, Vi could be an F. Vi could easily be worse than Congregate, for all I know. It's hard to read.
It is, yeah.
I guess in theory, if Elves are... The top decks we're calling are really bad for Vi. Like, some of the decks that could be were Skelliga decks.
One thing to consider with these top decks is, will the list change quite a lot because Vi isn't around now? Will people start playing different cards? Will maybe Locks become less prevalent in Nilfgaard? Will maybe Tool Punish become less prevalent in the Witcher deck? I would say both of those are quite efficient to play in those decks, but there are considerations swapping out now that Vi isn't around, I guess. So what are your thoughts on potentially that and how that will affect the matchups? Do you think that will be changed at all?
I do think that these decks will change how they're built. I could definitely see Northern Realms going back to the scenario version, the location version, as it's only really Kelly that they need it for now. I guess Nilfgaard it's okay as well against, but I don't think you need it versus against Nilfgaard. Like, basically your plan is win round 1 bleed, where your Geralt doesn't really do too much anyway. Like, because you don't really want to go into a 10 card round 3 against Nilfgaard. That isn't how you're going to be playing that matchup. So whilst Geralt is useful in that scenario, it's not really where you want to be anyway. But outside of that, like, that might change, but again, you could see you still running a Baron, running an on-Sace maybe, running the Geralt. Like, those sort of cards is all still fine instead of the location, because the location isn't that great. I could see COC being cut from Elves again, like maybe just playing something else, but at the same time, if you cut COC, Kali becomes worse, Nilfgaard maybe becomes worse, but again, Nilfgaard you kind of want to win round 1 and bleed anyway. And then what other decks are running random Tor Punishes that they shouldn't be? There's not really that much else that is running those random Tor Punishes. Kelly probably cuts its Spores, which isn't a big deal, but outside of that, like, it's mainly these Spores decks that are going to get cut, right? Is the main difference from Vi being gone. Decks are mainly just going to cut a random Spores. Play something that actually finds value, maybe. A Squirrel or whatever.
Yeah, I will say that finding a space, you probably don't want to cut Curse Corruption when you're already like looking for a replacement for Justice potentially. So that might.
Yeah, I don't think there's much chance of Elves cutting Curse. I think the card feels pretty good, and it's pretty difficult. Like, I think the reason the movement cards just kind of slid into Elves for as long as they did was just because it was like, well, what else do you play? These cards are solid-ish standalone value. They're just a really awkward distribution and kind of not what the deck is trying to do. Like, they don't really go low to the ground, and they give answers value, and they give Nilfgaard cards value. So I think with Justice also being worse, Curse is kind of mandatory, especially with Kelly. And I would argue against Witchers and Ball, that card is quite strong. Like, Skelliga is sort of like the anti-Vi. Skelliga just doesn't go tall. And I think Skelliga will be largely removed from the meta as well. So I feel like tall removal, other than like random Spores type texts, is about the same value. I also think that Witchers will not go back to Kaer Seren. I think that card was cut because that card was bad more than anything. Like, if you don't want a tall removal, I think you run on Sace.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Well, I think that just about wraps it up for us. Once again, I want to say thank you to Redrame for coming on and joining us. I know he's got a busy schedule at the moment, and good luck.
Thanks for having me.
Good luck with your last few days. Well, last day now, isn't it? Of
last few hours more than anything. It's like 12 hours.
Yeah, so
I guess I'll refresh and see how the others are doing. Okay, not much progress, Pog. Pog's up to like 1,000 games now. I guess I'm not one to talk. But
Yeah.
But yeah, it's going to be an interesting watch for all of us. I think we're all going to be there with bated breath, and it'll be great to see you doing. I mean, it's great to see you up there anyway, proving that not only can NA do it, but you're also proving a lot of people wrong that said you were just a deck builder, which is great. Obviously, seeing you go to the Open, we saw that you are more than that, and it's great to see you proving it this season on ladder. It's really nice to see. So, and thank you again for taking the time out from this, because I know you are taking it very seriously.
No, thank you so much for having me. I really like this channel. I really like what y'all are trying to do. It feels like what I have always told myself I'm going to try to do, but ends up being really difficult to sort of get that momentum on your own to like make this sort of stuff. And I think y'all are just really cool people, and I like the initiative.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
It's a lot easier to just show up.
That is true.
I dig it.
And if you also feel like Redrame, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can like this video and subscribe to the channel. So thank you for that plug, Mr. Redrame. Having said all that, that'll be it from us today. Stay tuned. We will be doing more of these videos in the future, at least one of these every season. and we will, of course, undoubtedly be bringing more content to you. But that's it from me. So goodbye from me. And
see ya.
see you
See ya.
guys.